It started as a routine flight from New York to London, but it ended with flashing lights, a terrified entitled passenger, and a veteran gate supervisor collapsing in the first-class aisle. When a wealthy socialite demanded a black woman be dragged out of her seat, she thought she was just exerting her usual privilege. She had no idea the woman quietly sipping sparkling water held the fate of the entire airline in her hands. What happened next destroyed one woman's life forever. The rain lashed aggressively against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of John F. Kennedy International Airport, distorting the flashing lights of the tarmac vehicles into blurry streaks of amber and red. Inside Terminal 4, the atmosphere was a chaotic blend of delayed flight anxiety and the frantic rush of international travel. But inside the sanctuary of Flight 802's first-class cabin, the world was meant to be quiet, exclusive, and perfectly climate-controlled. Josephine Caldwell loved the minutes just before boarding completed. At 42, Josephine was a woman who commanded respect without ever having to raise her voice. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal blazer and matching slacks, she looked every bit the high-powered executive she was. She had just wrapped up a grueling 72-hour series of board meetings in Manhattan and was desperately looking forward to the transatlantic flight to Heathrow. Slipping into seat 2A, a plush lie-flat window seat, she exhaled a long, steady breath. She stowed her leather tote under the seat in front of her, adjusted the noise-canceling headphones around her neck, and pulled out her tablet to review a final set of confidential financial quarterly reports. The cabin was only half full at this point. Soft jazz played over the intercom, mingling with the muffled thud of luggage being loaded into the cargo hold beneath them. It was peaceful, and then the peace shattered. Cynthia Covington did not just walk onto an airplane. She announced her presence to it. Dripping in conspicuous designer logos, a Gucci belt that was slightly too tight, a Louis Vuitton monogrammed carry-on that swung dangerously close to other passengers' heads, and oversized Chanel sunglasses pushed up into her aggressively highlighted blonde hair, Cynthia marched down the jet bridge as if she owned the aircraft. Trailing meekly behind her was her husband, David, a man whose perpetual slouch suggested decades of silent apologies on his wife's behalf. Cynthia's ticket was for seat 2B, directly on the aisle next to Josephine. As Cynthia stopped at row 2, her eyes landed on Josephine. The older woman's gaze flicked up and down, taking in Josephine's dark skin, her natural hair styled in an elegant French twist, and her understated, label-free clothing. Instantly, Cynthia's expression soured, her lips pursing into a tight, hard line. The air around them seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Excuse me," Cynthia barked, not bothering with a greeting. Her voice was grating, loud enough to turn the heads of the passengers in row 1 and 3. "I think you're in the wrong section." Josephine did not immediately look up from her tablet. She calmly finished reading a sentence about aviation fuel subsidies, swiped the screen, and then slowly turned her head. Her expression was neutral, her dark eyes entirely unbothered. "I'm sorry," I said, Cynthia enunciated slowly, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand English. "You are in the wrong section. This is first class. Premium cabin. Economy is back there, through the curtain." She gestured wildly with a perfectly manicured hand toward the rear of the aircraft. Josephine stared at her for a long, quiet moment. "I am perfectly aware of where I am sitting, thank you." She turned her attention back to her tablet, dismissing the woman entirely. Cynthia gasped, a sharp, dramatic intake of air. She turned to her husband, who was trying to pretend he was deeply fascinated by the overhead bin latch. David, did you hear that? The absolute nerve. She slammed her heavy tote bag onto the console between their seats, intentionally letting the heavy brass buckle clatter against Josephine's armrest. Cynthia, just sit down, David muttered, his face flushing crimson. The flight's going to be full. Let's just get settled. No, David, I will not just sit down, Cynthia hissed loudly. She remained standing in the aisle, blocking the flow of the remaining business-class passengers boarding behind her. I paid $12,000 for these tickets so we could have a peaceful, exclusive flight for our anniversary. I did not pay to sit next to someone who clearly snagged a lucky standby upgrade and doesn't know how to behave. Josephine paused her reading again. She didn't show anger, but the temperature in her eyes grew icy. My ticket is for 2A. Your ticket is for 2B. I suggest you stow your luggage and take your seat so the rest of the passengers can board. You are blocking the aisle. Don't you dare tell me what to do. Cynthia's voice spiked an octave, piercing the cabin's ambient noise. You have no right to speak to me that way. I know how this works. You people wait at the gate and beg the agents for a free upgrade because the seats are empty. Well, they aren't empty anymore. Across the aisle in seat 2F, a young tech executive named Thomas Wright lowered his newspaper, his eyebrows raised in absolute disbelief. He caught Josephine's eye and gave her a sympathetic, exhausted look. Josephine offered a microscopic nod of acknowledgement, but remained silent. She had dealt with women like Cynthia Covington her entire life. Women who felt threatened by her very existence in spaces they believed belonged solely to them. Usually, Josephine would simply let the flight attendants handle it, but today the exhaustion of the past 3 days was heavy in her bones. She didn't want a fight, but she certainly wasn't going to be bullied out of her seat. I paid for this seat, Josephine said, her voice eerily calm, possessing a quiet authority that usually terrified corporate vice presidents. I am not moving. If you have an issue with the seating arrangement, I suggest you go speak to the crew. Cynthia's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. Oh, believe me, I will. The cabin crew was in the middle of their pre-departure beverage service. Samantha Hayes, a flight attendant with 7 years of experience and a perpetually friendly, practiced smile, was making her way down the aisle with a silver tray of champagne flutes and sparkling water. Samantha was exhausted. It was her 3rd transatlantic leg of the week, but she maintained her flawless customer service persona. As Samantha approached row 2, Cynthia practically lunged into the aisle to intercept her. "Excuse me, miss," Cynthia snapped, waving a hand in Samantha's face. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you? Would you care for a pre-departure beverage?" Samantha asked smoothly, though her eyes darted nervously to the tense posture of the black woman sitting in the window seat and the aggressive stance of the blonde woman towering over her. "I don't want a drink. I want you to do your job," Cynthia sneered. She pointed a sharp acrylic fingernail directly at Josephine. "I want this woman removed from this seat immediately." Samantha's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there a problem with the seat?" "The problem is that she doesn't belong here," Cynthia declared loudly. The low hum of conversations in the first-class cabin ceased entirely. Even the passengers in row 4 were craning their necks to see what was happening. This is first class. She clearly snuck up here during the boarding rush. I want you to check her boarding pass right now and send her back to coach where she belongs. Samantha blinked, momentarily taken aback by the raw, unfiltered prejudice in the woman's demand. She turned to Josephine, who had calmly placed her tablet on her lap and was looking at Samantha with an expression of mild, patient endurance. "Ma'am," Samantha addressed Josephine gently, "is everything all right?" "I am fine, thank you," Josephine replied, her voice rich and steady. "I would love a glass of sparkling water if you have one." "Of course," Samantha said, turning to hand Josephine the glass. Cynthia slapped her hand against the overhead bin, producing a sharp thwack that made several passengers jump. "Are you ignoring me? I gave you a directive. I want her ticket checked. I know for a fact my friend was supposed to be on this flight in seat 2A, and this woman has clearly stolen it." It was a blatant, desperate lie, and everyone in earshot knew it. The sheer audacity of the claim hung in the air, thick and suffocating. David, Cynthia's husband, had buried his face in his hands, wishing the floor of the Boeing 777 would open up and swallow him whole. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down," Samantha said, her tone shifting from accommodating to firm. "I assure you, our gate agents scan every boarding pass before passengers enter the jet bridge. No one can simply sneak into first class. The manifest shows that seat 2A is legally occupied." "Your manifest is wrong," Cynthia screeched. The red flush of fury was creeping up her neck, clashing terribly with her heavy foundation. "She's a thief. She probably stole somebody's printed pass at the terminal. Look at her. Does she look like she belongs in a $12,000 seat? I demand you remove her. If you don't, I will have your job. Do you know who my husband is?" "Cynthia, stop it," David hissed, finally finding a shred of a spine. "Sit down now." "Shut up, David." Cynthia whipped around to glare at him before turning her wrath back onto the flight attendant. "I am a Platinum Elite member with this airline. I fly with you 5 times a year. I pay your salary. I want her out of my row." Now, Josephine took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water. She looked up at Cynthia, her eyes dark and unreadable. "You are making a fool of yourself." Cynthia gasped again, clutching her pearls in a gesture so cliché it almost felt rehearsed. "Did you hear her? She just threatened me. She's aggressive. She's a security threat." The word threat was the nuclear option in aviation. As soon as the word left Cynthia's lips, the protocol changed. Samantha's face went pale. The moment a passenger claimed they felt threatened, the flight crew was legally obligated to investigate and resolve the issue before the cabin doors could be closed. The captain, already fighting a tight departure window due to the incoming storm, was not going to be happy. "Ma'am," Samantha said to Cynthia, her voice trembling slightly, "please step into the galley. Let's discuss this away from the other passengers." "No," Cynthia shouted, crossing her arms over her chest, anchoring her feet into the carpet of the aisle. "I am not moving until she is dragged off this plane. Call the police. Call the gate agent. I want the supervisor on board right now." Thomas Wright, the tech executive across the aisle, finally spoke up. "Lady, you're the only one being aggressive here. Leave the poor woman alone and sit down so we can take off." Cynthia whipped her head toward Thomas. "Mind your own business. You don't know what she did. She pushed me when I was trying to sit down. She assaulted me." The entire cabin gasped. It was another brazen lie. Josephine hadn't moved an inch since Cynthia boarded. Josephine finally set her water down. Her face had gone perfectly still. The mild annoyance had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. She reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing against her phone. She didn't pull it out yet. She wanted to see exactly how far Cynthia Covington was willing to go to ruin a stranger's life. "I am going to get the gate supervisor," Samantha said breathlessly, backing away toward the front galley. She grabbed the internal phone to call the captain and the gate desk. Please, everyone, remain in your seats. Good, Cynthia shouted after her. She turned back to Josephine with a triumphant, wicked smirk. You're done. You thought you could get away with this, but you picked the wrong woman to mess with. You're going to be leaving this plane in handcuffs. Josephine merely picked up her tablet again. We shall see. The boarding process ground to a complete halt. A line of frustrated economy passengers was backed up onto the jet bridge, murmuring complaints and checking their watches. The captain made a vague announcement over the PA system about a minor seating discrepancy in the forward cabin. But the tension in first class was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. 3 minutes later, heavy footsteps pounded down the jet bridge. Richard Montgomery, the veteran gate supervisor for Terminal 4, burst through the aircraft doors. Richard was a man in his late 50s, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face shining with the sweat of a stressful, delayed flight Friday evening. He had been dealing with angry passengers all day, and his patience was wearing dangerously thin. What is the situation here? Richard asked loudly as he approached row 2. Cynthia immediately pounced, weaponizing her tears with terrifying speed. The angry, shrieking woman vanished, replaced instantly by a terrified, fragile victim. She clutched Richard's sleeve, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God you're here," Cynthia whimpered, pointing a shaky finger at Josephine. "This woman, I don't know how she got on the plane. She stole my friend's boarding pass, and when I tried to ask her politely to move, she shoved me. She physically assaulted me and told me she had a weapon." A collective gasp echoed from the surrounding passengers. "That is a lie," Thomas Wright yelled from across the aisle. "She didn't touch her. This crazy lady is making the whole thing up. He's with her." Cynthia shrieked, pointing at Thomas. "They're probably working together. Please, you have to get her off this plane. I don't feel safe. My husband doesn't feel safe." She elbowed David hard in the ribs. Yes, we don't feel safe," David mumbled to the floor, looking absolutely miserable. Richard Montgomery held up his hands, trying to control the escalating chaos. His eyes darted between the weeping, wealthy-looking white woman in designer clothes and the silent, sharply dressed black woman in the window seat. Richard's training dictated that he evaluate all threats seriously. But Richard also had a mortgage, a stressed-out station manager breathing down his neck, and a wealthy Platinum Elite member screaming about assault. Subconsciously, the societal conditioning and the path of least resistance kicked in. He looked at Josephine, his expression hardening into one of stern authority. "Ma'am," Richard said, addressing Josephine, "I need you to stand up, gather your belongings, and step off the aircraft with me immediately." Josephine did not move. "I have done nothing wrong. I am sitting in the seat I paid for. This woman is harassing me. She shoved me," Cynthia wailed, burying her face in her hands. "She said she was going to hurt me." "Ma'am," Richard repeated, his voice rising, adopting the clipped, aggressive tone of a cop giving orders. "I am not going to ask you again. An allegation of assault has been made. You are a security risk to this flight. If you do not stand up and exit the aircraft right now, I will have Port Authority police drag you off in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" The cabin was dead silent. Even the soft jazz seemed to have stopped. Everyone was watching. Some passengers had pulled out their phones and started recording. Josephine looked at Richard. She didn't look angry. She looked deeply, profoundly disappointed. It was a look that made Richard suddenly, inexplicably nervous. "Mr. Montgomery, is it?" Josephine asked, reading his golden name tag. "Yes, and I am giving you a lawful order to disembark," Richard said, puffing out his chest. "Mr. Montgomery, Josephine said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Before you call the police, before you delay this flight any further, and before you make a career-ending mistake based on the racist hysterics of a woman who simply cannot stand the sight of me in first class, I strongly suggest you ask for my identification." "I don't need to see your ID here," Richard snapped, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "We can sort this out at the gate desk. Now move, check her ID," Cynthia demanded, dropping the crying act for a second. "Prove she's a fraud. Prove she stole the ticket. Do it right here in front of everyone." Richard hesitated. The protocol actually did require him to verify the identity of a disputed passenger before physical removal, just to ensure he was pulling the right person. He sighed in frustration. "Fine, hand over your boarding pass and your government-issued ID." "Right now," Richard ordered, holding out his hand. Josephine held his gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Slowly, deliberately, Josephine reached into her leather tote bag. She bypassed her wallet. Instead, she pulled out a sleek black leather card holder bearing the embossed silver logo of the airline itself. She opened it and extracted 2 items. The first was her boarding pass for seat 2A. The second was a heavy, solid titanium identification card. It was not a driver's license. It was not a passport. It was an internal Level 1 ultra-secure aviation badge, bordered in a distinct, glowing iridescent blue, a color combination that Richard Montgomery had only ever seen in training manuals and hushed employee briefings. Josephine held the cards out. Richard snatched them angrily, ready to declare them fake. He looked at the boarding pass first. Seat 2A, Caldwell Josephine. Then he looked at the titanium ID card. The air left Richard's lungs in a violent, rushing whoosh. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly painted wall. His hands began to shake violently, the heavy metal card rattling against the plastic boarding pass. His eyes widened to impossible proportions as he read the name, the title, and the supreme clearance codes etched into the metal. Josephine Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer, Majority Shareholder, Board of Directors. Richard Montgomery was not looking at a standby passenger. He was not looking at a seat thief. He was looking at the woman who had just purchased the entire airline 3 days ago. Part 4. The Revelation and the Collapse. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound in the first-class cabin was the gentle hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit and the ragged, shallow breathing of Richard Montgomery. Richard stared at the titanium card resting in his trembling palm. The iridescent blue border seemed to glow under the LED cabin lights, mocking him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to scream, but his vocal cords simply refused to function. His mind was rapidly replaying the last 3 minutes of his life, calculating the exact trajectory of his impending termination, the loss of his pension, and the utter ruin of his 30-year career in aviation. "Well," Cynthia Covington barked, shattering the silence. She slapped her hand against her thigh in aggressive impatience. "What is it? Is it a fake FBI badge? I saw a documentary about people who buy fake federal IDs online to get free flights. Read it out loud, Mr. Montgomery. Show everyone what a fraud this woman is." Richard couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. He looked at Josephine Caldwell, who remained seated, hands elegantly folded in her lap, watching him with the detached curiosity of a predator observing a trapped mouse. Behind Richard, heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. "Richard, what on earth is the hold-up?" A sharp, authoritative voice called out. Marching into the cabin was Brenda Walsh, the senior terminal duty manager. Brenda was a formidable woman in her late 40s, known across JFK for running her gates like a military operation. She wore a tailored navy blue uniform with a gold supervisor's pin gleaming on her lapel. She had seen the boarding delay on her terminal monitor and had personally stormed down to the aircraft to figure out why Flight 802 hadn't closed its doors. "We are missing our departure window, Richard," Brenda snapped as she pushed past the flight attendants in the galley. "Air traffic control is about to put us on a 2-hour ground hold if we don't push back in 4 minutes. Why are you just standing there?" Brenda marched up to row 2. She took one look at Cynthia's flushed, furious face, Josephine's icy calm, and Richard's pale, sweat-drenched terror. "He's stalling," Cynthia shrieked, pointing her acrylic nail at Brenda. "Are you the manager? Thank God this woman is a fraud. She stole a first-class ticket, assaulted me, and now she just handed him some fake piece of metal instead of a real ID. Arrest her." Brenda's eyes narrowed. She had dealt with Cynthia Covington before. Every gate agent in Terminal 4 knew the Covington name, and they all dreaded it. Cynthia was infamous for screaming at staff, demanding compensation for imaginary slights, and getting junior agents written up for looking at her wrong. "Richard," Brenda said sternly, holding out her hand. "Give me the ID." Richard slowly turned his head toward his boss. His eyes were wide and glassy. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. With a hand that shook so badly the metal clicked against his fingernails, he handed the titanium card to Brenda. Brenda snatched it, thoroughly annoyed. She adjusted her reading glasses, preparing to tear into the passenger who was causing the delay. She looked at the embossed silver letters. Josephine Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer, Majority Shareholder, Board of Directors. Brenda's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, audible gasp that carried all the way to row 5. Just 3 days ago, every manager in the company had received a highly confidential, top-priority internal memo. A massive corporate merger had finalized. The airline had been fully acquired by a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm based in Manhattan. The memo included a strict directive. The new CEO, Josephine Caldwell, was known for flying unannounced on commercial routes to audit the staff, the service, and the operations. The memo explicitly stated that her titanium Level 1 clearance badge was the highest authority in the company, overriding even the captains and the regional directors. Brenda looked from the card down to the black woman sitting quietly in seat 2A, the woman who had just been threatened with police removal, the woman Cynthia Covington had called a thief, the woman whose airline they were currently standing inside. The blood drained from Brenda's face so rapidly her vision tunneled. A cold sweat erupted across her forehead, and a loud, high-pitched ringing filled her ears. The overwhelming wave of sheer, absolute terror short-circuited her nervous system. "Oh my God," Brenda whispered, her voice barely a squeak. "Oh my dear God. Tell her," Cynthia demanded, stepping closer, completely oblivious to the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. "Tell her she's going to jail. Call the police right now, or I swear to you I will have your job too." Brenda looked at Cynthia. Then she looked back at Josephine. Josephine simply tilted her head, waiting. The sheer gravity of the situation slammed into Brenda all at once. The liability, the lawsuit, the catastrophic PR disaster. Her entire career evaporating in a single racist confrontation she had walked right into. Brenda Walsh gasped for air, but her lungs refused to expand. Her eyes rolled back into her head, the titanium card slipping from her fingers to clatter loudly onto the aisle floor. With a soft groan, Brenda's knees buckled, and she collapsed entirely, fainting dead away onto the patterned carpet of the first-class aisle. Pandemonium erupted. "Brenda!" Richard screamed, snapping out of his shock and diving to the floor to check his manager. Passengers cried out. Flight attendant Samantha Hayes dropped her silver tray, the champagne flutes shattering against the bulkhead as she rushed forward. "Oh my God, she's having a heart attack!" Cynthia screamed, jumping backward and practically climbing into her husband's lap to get away from the unconscious woman. "The fake ID, it has a chemical on it. That woman just poisoned her. Are you out of your mind?" Thomas Wright yelled from across the aisle, unbuckling his seat belt. "She just fainted. Is there a doctor on board?" "I'm a physician," a calm voice called out from seat 4C. A tall, gray-haired man, Dr. Jonathan Webber, hurried down the aisle. He knelt beside Brenda, checking her pulse and clearing her airway. "She's breathing. Her pulse is rapid but strong. It looks like a classic vasovagal syncope. She just passed out from shock or stress. Someone get her legs elevated. It's her fault." Cynthia shrieked, pointing wildly at Josephine. "She did this. She's a terrorist. I want her off this plane. David, do something." David Covington looked like he was about to vomit. He was staring at the heavy titanium card lying on the floor, catching the light. He couldn't read the small text from his angle, but he recognized the iridescent blue border from high-level corporate security briefings. His stomach began to tie itself into cold, hard knots. The commotion had finally reached the cockpit. The reinforced security door swung open, and Captain William Mitchell stepped out. He was a towering, silver-haired veteran of the skies, radiating authority. "What is going on in my cabin?" Captain Mitchell demanded, his booming voice cutting through the shouting and the chaos. He looked down at the unconscious gate manager, the kneeling doctor, and the shattered glass. "Captain!" Cynthia cried out, dramatically clutching her chest. "Thank God. You need to have this woman arrested. She assaulted me. She has a fake ID, and she just did something to your manager. She's dangerous." Captain Mitchell ignored Cynthia entirely. He stepped over Brenda's legs and bent down, picking up the titanium ID card from the floor. He looked at it. Unlike the gate agents, Captain Mitchell didn't freeze, and he didn't faint. He was a former Navy pilot. He was trained to handle catastrophic system failures at 30,000 feet. But as he read the name on the card, his jaw tightened, and he slowly, rigidly stood at attention. Captain Mitchell turned to face seat 2A. He didn't look at Cynthia. He looked directly at Josephine Caldwell. To the absolute shock of everyone in the cabin, the captain of the aircraft offered a crisp, formal nod of deep respect. "Miss Caldwell," Captain Mitchell said, his voice completely devoid of his usual folksy intercom charm. It was replaced by a tone of absolute deference. "I was not informed you were joining us on this flight today, ma'am. Is there an issue with your accommodation?" The entire cabin went dead silent. Again, Cynthia's jaw dropped. She looked from the captain to Josephine, and back again. What did you just call her?" Josephine Caldwell finally sat up straight. She adjusted her blazer, her movement slow, deliberate, and radiating power. She looked at Captain Mitchell and offered a tight, polite smile. "Good evening, Captain Mitchell," Josephine said smoothly. "My apologies for the disruption. I had hoped to quietly review the in-flight service protocols on the London route. Unfortunately, it seems there is a severe breakdown in customer conduct and gate security that requires my immediate attention. Mrs. Caldwell." Cynthia stammered, the name finally registering in her brain. She looked at her husband. "David, why is he calling her that? Who is she?" David Covington was no longer flushed. He was bone white. The color had fled his face so completely he looked like a corpse. David was the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions for Covington Wealth Management, a firm that, just 48 hours ago, had been subjected to a hostile, multi-million-dollar buyout by a massive conglomerate. The conglomerate's name was Caldwell Holdings. David's eyes locked onto Josephine's face, recognizing her from the Forbes articles and the terrifying corporate dossier sitting on his desk back in Manhattan. He had never met her in person, but he knew exactly who she was. Cynthia, David choked out, his voice a pathetic wheezing rasp. Shut up. Shut your mouth right now. Excuse me. Cynthia rounded on him, enraged. Don't you ever tell me to shut up. I am your wife. Cynthia, please, David begged, literally grabbing her arm and trying to pull her down into her seat. That's Josephine Caldwell. She's the CEO. She owns the airline. She owns my company, Cynthia. She owns everything. The words hung in the air, echoing in the quiet cabin. Cynthia's brain, entirely unaccustomed to facing consequences, violently rejected the information. You're lying, she's not the CEO. Look at her. CEOs don't fly commercial, and they certainly don't look like her. It was the quiet part said entirely out loud. The racist assumption that had fueled her entire tirade was now laid bare under the bright cabin lights, ugly and undeniable. Several passengers gasped in disgust. Thomas Wright let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Wow, you really dug your own grave, lady. Josephine stood up. She didn't rush. She moved with the fluid, commanding grace of a woman who was entirely in control of the room. She smoothed her trousers, picked up her tablet, and stepped out into the aisle, forcing Richard, who was still hovering over the waking Brenda, to scramble backward to give her space. Josephine turned to face Cynthia. They were now eye to eye, but Josephine's presence made her seem 10 feet tall. Cynthia Covington, Josephine said. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was cold steel. Platinum Elite member since 2018. Married to David Covington. You paid $12,000 for these tickets. Cynthia swallowed hard, her bravado finally beginning to crack under the sheer, crushing weight of Josephine's aura. Yes, I am a loyal customer. You were a loyal customer, Josephine corrected her softly. As of this moment, your Platinum Elite status is permanently revoked. Furthermore, you are hereby banned for life from flying on this airline, any of its subsidiaries, and any partner airlines in our global alliance. You can't do that, Cynthia screeched, the panic finally setting in. I have rights. I paid for this seat. You paid for the privilege of utilizing our services, a privilege you have abused by harassing my crew, lying to a federal gate agent, faking an assault claim, and delaying a multi-million-dollar aircraft, Josephine replied, her tone surgical in its precision. She turned to Captain Mitchell. Captain, do we have Port Authority police standing by at the gate? Yes, ma'am, Captain Mitchell replied instantly. Standard protocol for a reported passenger disturbance. They are waiting at the top of the jet bridge. Excellent, Josephine said. She looked down at Richard, who was trembling like a leaf as he helped Brenda sit up. Mr. Montgomery, you were highly eager to have someone dragged off this aircraft in handcuffs a moment ago. I suggest you go to the top of the jet bridge, fetch the officers, and have them escort Mrs. Covington off my airplane. Cynthia's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. No, you can't. We have non-refundable hotel reservations in London. It's our anniversary. David, tell her she can't do this. David Covington didn't look at his wife. He looked directly at Josephine, tears of absolute humiliation pooling in his eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," David pleaded, his voice cracking. I beg you. Please, I am the SVP of Covington Wealth. I know about the buyout. Please." She had a long day. She drank too much in the lounge. "Please don't do this." Josephine slowly turned her gaze to David. The silence in the cabin was so profound you could hear the rain hitting the glass outside. "Mr. Covington," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "your wife stood in the aisle of my aircraft and demanded I be treated like a criminal simply because she did not believe a black woman belonged in a space she deemed hers. She lied, she threatened my staff, and you stood by and watched her do it. If this is how the senior vice president of my newly acquired wealth management firm handles high-pressure conflict and ethical dilemmas, I believe we have a serious personnel issue to discuss on Monday morning." David's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, the realization that his wife had just destroyed his marriage, his vacation, and his multi-million-dollar career in the span of 10 minutes, finally breaking him. He slumped down in his seat, utterly defeated. "Get my bags, David," Cynthia cried, tears, real ones this time, ruining her expensive mascara, leaving thick, black streaks down her cheeks. "We're leaving. I am not going to be treated like this. I am calling my lawyer." "You will need a very good one," Josephine said mildly, "because I am also directing our corporate legal team to file civil charges against you for the operational costs of delaying this aircraft. A Boeing 777 costs approximately $300 a minute to sit idle at a gate. You have delayed us by 22 minutes. We will be sending you the bill." Cynthia let out a high-pitched, strangled sob. She tried to grab her Louis Vuitton bag, but her hands were shaking so violently she dropped it, spilling a mess of makeup, expensive perfumes, and credit cards all over the aisle floor. At that moment, 2 heavily armed Port Authority police officers stepped onto the aircraft, their radios crackling. They looked at Captain Mitchell, then at the crying woman on her hands and knees, frantically gathering her lipsticks. "Captain?" the lead officer asked. "We got a call about a hostile passenger?" "Yes, officer," Captain Mitchell said, pointing a steady finger at Cynthia. "That woman right there. She is no longer welcome on this flight. Please escort her and her husband to the terminal. If she resists, you have my full authorization to arrest her." The 2 heavily armed Port Authority police officers did not care about Cynthia Covington's designer clothes, her husband's corporate title, or the fact that it was her anniversary. They were responding to a level 2 passenger disturbance, and their patience was non-existent. "Ma'am, step into the aisle and move toward the exit," the lead officer commanded, his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt. "Do not make me ask you again." Cynthia was trembling so violently she could barely stand. The arrogant, shrieking woman who had marched onto the Boeing 777 was entirely gone, replaced by a hyperventilating, mascara-stained shell. She looked frantically around the first-class cabin, desperately seeking a sympathetic face. She found none. Thomas Wright, the tech executive in seat 2F, was openly holding his phone up, recording the entire spectacle with a satisfied smirk. Dr. Weber, who was still monitoring the recovering gate manager, shook his head in absolute disgust. Even Samantha Hayes, the flight attendant Cynthia had berated, stood near the galley with her arms crossed, her professional smile completely replaced by a look of cold, justified vindication. "David!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice cracking as she tugged on her husband's jacket. "David, do something. They can't do this to me. I'm a platinum elite." David Covington violently yanked his arm out of her grasp. His face was a mask of utter despair and fury. "You have ruined us," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he had suppressed for 20 years of marriage. "Get your bags, Cynthia. Just shut up and walk." With shaking hands, Cynthia gathered her scattered lipsticks, shoving them haphazardly into her Louis Vuitton tote. David grabbed their roller bags from the overhead bin. As they stepped into the aisle, the officers flanked them, treating the wealthy couple with the same clinical detachment they would use on a belligerent drunk. "Keep moving," the second officer instructed. The walk down the aisle was agonizing. Because the forward boarding door had already been closed in preparation for departure, the officers had to escort them backward, through the business class cabin, and toward the mid-plane exit where the secondary jet bridge was still attached. As Cynthia and David walked the grueling gauntlet, the business and premium economy passengers, who had heard the shouting and had been delayed by nearly half an hour, showed absolutely no mercy. "Bye, Karen," someone yelled from row 12. "Hope you enjoy the bus." Another passenger chimed in, followed by a ripple of laughter. Cynthia kept her head down, sobbing audibly into her hands, the heavy gold bracelets on her wrists clanking together like cheap shackles. David walked 5 paces ahead of her, his head bowed in profound, agonizing humiliation. He knew that by Monday morning, his life as he knew it would be over. Back in the first-class cabin, the heavy atmosphere began to lift, replaced by the collective adrenaline of witnessing absolute justice. Dr. Weber helped Brenda Walsh, the senior terminal duty manager, into a sitting position against the bulkhead. Brenda was pale, clutching a bottle of water, her eyes darting nervously toward seat 2A. Richard Montgomery, the gate supervisor, stood paralyzed near the galley, clutching his clipboard like a shield. Josephine Caldwell remained standing in the aisle. She smoothed the lapels of her charcoal blazer and turned her attention to the 2 terrified airline employees. "Miss Caldwell," Brenda croaked, her voice dry and trembling, "I am so profoundly sorry. I didn't know. We didn't realize who you were." "That is precisely the problem, Brenda," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register that carried the weight of the entire corporation. "It shouldn't matter who I am." Richard flinched as if he had been struck. He looked down at his shoes, unable to meet the CEO's gaze. "Mr. Montgomery," Josephine continued, turning her sharp eyes on him, "you were presented with a screaming, irate passenger who made a baseless accusation of assault against a quiet, seated passenger. Instead of following the airline's strict security protocols, which dictate that you de-escalate, separate the parties, and verify the manifest, you took the word of a wealthy, white woman in designer clothing as absolute gospel." Richard opened his mouth, trying to find an excuse, but no words came out. He knew she was right. "You looked at me," Josephine said softly, "a black woman sitting quietly in first class, and your implicit bias made the decision for you. You assumed I was guilty. You threatened me with police force without ever checking my boarding pass. You bypassed every single training module you have been given in your 30-year career, simply because Cynthia Covington yelled loudly enough." I panicked, ma'am," Richard whispered, tears of shame pricking his eyes. "She said she was assaulted. I was just trying to protect the flight." "You were protecting the path of least resistance," Josephine corrected him coldly. "This airline transports millions of people a year. Our passengers entrust us with their safety, their dignity, and their lives. If my gate supervisors can be bullied into abandoning protocol by a loud voice and a shiny credit card, then we have a catastrophic security failure on our hands." Brenda let out a small sob. "Are we fired, miss?" Caldwell. Josephine looked at them both for a long, silent moment. The entire cabin was hanging on her next words. "If I fire you today," Josephine said, her tone clinical, "I create a massive logistical headache for Terminal 4 on a Friday night, and I lose 2 employees who possess decades of institutional knowledge. Furthermore, firing you does not fix the systemic bias that led to this moment. It merely punishes it." Richard and Brenda looked up, a tiny, fragile spark of hope igniting in their chests. "You are not fired yet," Josephine stated. "However, effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay for 2 weeks. When you return, you will be stripped of your supervisory titles and placed on probation for 6 months. You will both complete an intensive, rigorous retraining program on conflict de-escalation, implicit bias, and security protocol adherence. If you pass, you may reapply for your current positions next year. If you fail, or if you ever let a passenger dictate your security protocols again, you will be terminated with cause and forfeit your pensions. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Richard gasped, weeping openly with relief. Thank you, Miss Caldwell. I swear to you it will never happen again." "See that it doesn't," Josephine said dismissively. She turned to Captain Mitchell, who was still standing at attention. "Captain, are we cleared for departure?" "Yes, ma'am," Captain Mitchell said, a slight, respectful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Air traffic control held our slot. We can push back in 3 minutes." "Excellent. Let's get these people to London." Josephine Caldwell calmly returned to seat 2A. She sat down, picked up her sparkling water, and opened her tablet as if the last 45 minutes had never happened. The cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. The weekend passed in a blur of luxurious silence for Josephine Caldwell, who spent her time in London successfully restructuring the European logistics hubs for Caldwell Holdings. But for the Covington family, the weekend was a waking nightmare. By Sunday evening, Thomas Wright's video of the incident had hit the internet. Thomas had posted the 3-minute clip to multiple social media platforms with the caption, "First Class Karen demands Black CEO be arrested for stealing her seat. Instantly regrets it." The internet did what the internet does best. It exploded. Within 12 hours, the video amassed over 25 million views across all platforms. The hashtag First Class Karen was trending globally. Internet sleuths took less than an hour to identify Cynthia Covington. By Sunday night, her social media accounts were flooded with tens of thousands of furious comments, forcing her to delete her Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn profiles entirely. But the digital fallout was nothing compared to the real-world consequences. Monday morning in Manhattan was crisp and clear. David Covington arrived at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Covington Wealth Management at 7:30 a.m., hoping against hope that he could quietly slip into his corner office, call his lawyers, and figure out a way to survive the corporate merger. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His hands shook as he approached the private executive elevator. He tapped his gold-rimmed security badge against the scanner. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. David froze. He tried again. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. "Covington?" David turned slowly. Standing in the polished marble lobby was Sarah Jenkins, the global head of human resources for Caldwell Holdings, flanked by 2 massive, unsmiling security guards. Sarah held a standard-issue cardboard box containing the personal contents of David's desk, a framed photo of his dog, his expensive fountain pens, and a crystal paperweight. "Sarah," David stammered, his face flushing crimson as several junior analysts walked past, openly staring at the scene. "What is this? My badge isn't working." I need to get up to my office to prepare for the transition meetings. You don't have an office anymore, David, Sarah said, her voice polite but entirely devoid of warmth. Your employment with Covington Wealth Management, and by extension Caldwell Holdings, has been terminated effectively immediately. David felt the floor drop out from beneath him. You can't do this. I have a contract. I have a golden parachute clause. Your contract contains a strict morality and public conduct clause, David, Sarah countered smoothly, handing him a thick manila envelope, which you and your wife egregiously violated on Friday evening when you caused a catastrophic public relations incident involving our chief executive officer. The legal department has reviewed the footage of the flight. You stood by while your wife hurled racial abuse, made false legal threats, and delayed a commercial flight by 22 minutes. That was her. Not me, David pleaded, his voice echoing pathetically in the grand lobby. I tried to stop her. You didn't try hard enough, Sarah said coldly. Mrs. Caldwell does not employ executives who lack the backbone to stand up to blatant bigotry, even in their own marriages. Your severance is voided under the gross misconduct clause. Sarah pushed the cardboard box into David's trembling hands. Furthermore, Sarah added, her eyes narrowing slightly, inside that envelope is an invoice from Caldwell Aviation. As Miss Caldwell promised, you are being billed for the operational delay of Flight 802. 22 minutes of idle tarmac time, fuel waste, and gate reassignment fees comes to exactly $6,600, plus an additional $4,000 in legal filing fees. Payment is due in 30 days, or we will place a lien on your property. David Covington stood paralyzed in the lobby of the company his grandfather had founded, holding a cardboard box and a $10,000 bill completely and utterly destroyed. The guards will escort you off the premises, Sarah said, turning on her heel. Have a nice day, David. By Wednesday, the Covington Country Club had quietly revoked their membership, citing conduct unbecoming. Cynthia's prestigious charity board politely asked her to step down to avoid unnecessary media distractions. The high society friend Cynthia had spent a decade cultivating suddenly stopped answering her texts. She became a pariah, trapped inside her sprawling Connecticut mansion, terrified to even go to the grocery store for fear of being recognized and recorded again. Justice had not just been served. It had been weaponized with surgical corporate precision. Meanwhile, high above the Atlantic Ocean, aboard a newly upgraded Caldwell Aviation Boeing 777, Josephine Caldwell sat in seat 2A. The cabin was peaceful. The soft jazz played gently over the intercom. A new flight attendant approached her with a silver tray. Sparkling water with a twist of lime, Miss Caldwell. Thank you, Josephine said, accepting the glass with a warm smile. She turned her attention back to her tablet, reviewing the latest quarterly profits, entirely unbothered, undisturbed, and undeniably in charge. Privilege and entitlement can blind people to reality, but true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. Cynthia Covington learned the hard way that you can't judge a book by its cover, especially when that book owns the entire library. Josephine Caldwell's quiet dignity and swift corporate justice prove that grace and accountability are the ultimate weapons against ignorance. If you loved this story of instant karma and absolute justice, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves seeing entitled people get put in their place. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more amazing real-life drama stories every single week. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in the CEO's shoes? See you next time.